Just like all of those weapons that don't really get much attention or credit in the Battlefield games, there's also a pretty fat pile of gadgets that often get neglected too. Gadgets that can, more often than not, provide loads of assistance to your team, make life a little bit easier for yourself, net you a bunch of easy points, and even do some useful things that you wouldn't even normally think about doing. The much more common gadgets are often fairly straightforward and simple to use, hence why most people tend to equip them. But if you like to play smart and think outside of the box, then there's also quite a few other lesser used gadgets that can be really powerful in their own ways and in certain situations. Ones that can turn the tide of battle and even help you survive and trick other players in ways they wouldn't see coming. It's these gadgets that we're going to be taking a look at today, the ones that should get a bit more recognition for actually being pretty decent in the right scenario. Here's my top 10 underrated gadgets in the Battlefield games.
Enemy tank over there.
So in that 10th place spot is Battlefield 1's anti-air rocket gun, a gadget designed for inflicting more damage on air vehicles, which came along a little bit later on in the game's life cycle. Now, considering how annoying bomber planes and airships can be in Battlefield 1, and considering there's such a lack of ways for infantry players to take them on and counter their attacks, it's quite surprising how little this gadget gets used. But then again, it's not too surprising with it featuring on the assault class, which is also home to a lot of other really powerful deadly forms of explosives. I guess the bog standard rocket gun is a lot less situational, with it being much more effective against both ground vehicles and infantry, so most players generally opt for that instead, which in a lot of cases makes pretty good sense. But we've all played in those operations matches where everyone constantly gets battered by the Ilya-Muromets bombers and biplanes, making objectives stressful to defend, because we're being harassed non-stop by some annoying bugger whizzing around in the sky, plopping bombs on everyone's head. It's times like that where more people should be switching over to those AA rocket guns and returning the fire, because although they're not always super effective on their own, they can be a lot deadlier if you team up with a few squad members with the same idea. And even if you don't take the plane down, they'll still have to fly away to fix up anyway, temporarily stopping them from being a nuisance. Next up on the list is the Portable Laser Designator, aka the PLD. A useful but situational gadget that can be extremely effective in combination with some good team tactics. This fancy little device is designed to laser paint vehicle targets, allowing your allies to lock onto them really easily with certain launchers, and deal more damage with them at the same time too. It's pretty similar to the SOFLAM, which I guess you could also say is a bit of an underrated gadget, but the SOFLAM is typically destroyed a lot easier due to it being stationary, whereas the PLD is something that you can just whip out and use at any time, whenever a vehicle comes into sight. The PLD isn't always a brilliant gadget to have equipped, down to a lot of teammates not paying much attention to those laser designations, and down to a lot of them carrying dumbfire launchers like RPGs, which aren't going to be able to lock onto the things you highlight. It definitely caters more to squads that are working together, maybe a few buddies that have all got the headsets on, coordinating attacks against tanks and choppers. But even when you're on your own, and the PLD isn't being used for its intended purpose, it can still be a handy little thing nevertheless, because with it being a recon gadget, it can sometimes be useful for finding enemies and opposing snipers over a medium range, due to it using an IRNV scope, lighting them up and making them easier to see and spot, sort of giving it dual purposes for helping yourself out along with your team. At the start of Battlefield 1's life cycle, the flare guns were a pretty rare thing to see on a lot of scout loadouts. It was a fairly new and obscure gadget for the series, and a lot of people tended to prioritise stuff like tripwire bombs and K-bullets instead. But the spotting flares grew in popularity over time, as people got used to their mechanics and realised how bloody effective they were, basically letting you hack the minimap. But the flash variant of the flare gun never really got the same kind of attention, making them an extremely rare thing to see. That flash variant basically does what it says on the tin, illuminating an area, making it hard for enemies to look in its direction, sort of giving off a bit of a flashbang effect when they do, also preventing enemies from spotting you while they're affected too. It might seem a bit pointless, because it'll often affect you if you fire it off close by, but you've got to remember that this is a recon gadget, so it's best used against players in the distance. Perhaps firing it in front of a row of snipers or an area that people are defending, making it easier for you to pick those players off with your rifle, while they're temporarily blinded by the power of God. It'll also help teammates advance forwards too, or make it harder for your enemies to push closer to the objective, making them effective around choke points, inside tight bunkers, and narrow trenches. Unfortunately, you do have to choose between those spot and flash flares, which is probably one of the big reasons why it's so underused. But the flash flares can still be really disruptive when used in the right places, especially in built up areas with lots of enemies. So if your whole team is running with spot flares, why not go help out in a different way and go and light the place up? Now, the XM25 grenade launcher isn't exactly the first thing that comes to mind when you're thinking of underrated Battlefield gadgets. A lot of people generally associate the XM25 with that powerful explosive airburst variant, one of Operation Locker's most notorious killers. But it's not all that often we think of the dart variant, which essentially just turns the gadget into a semi-automatic shotgun. Seemingly a simple thing on the face of it, but actually one of the most effective close-range weapons in the game. There's a few other gadgets that also act like shotguns, and these can be attached to your primary weapons with the underslung rail, sort of giving them the advantage when it comes to deploy speed. But although the XM25 dart might act as a standalone gadget, when it's actually out, it can often seem a lot deadlier, having a much faster fire rate, a reasonably strong damage output, and quite a few shots in its magazine, to ensure it's going to get the job done in CQC. Its blasts aren't quite as powerful as the 12 gauge buckshot shells, but they're a lot easier to spam against players close by, so if you miss your first shot, it's not the end of the world. If you're set up with a slow shooting long range primary weapon, like a scoped LMG or a DMR, then the XM25 dart can be a really good gadget to fill in the gap for when an enemy strays too close by. Definitely one of Battlefield 4's most underrated lethal gadgets. Next up is probably one of the most fun gadgets that you can use in the Battlefield games, the LIMPET charge in Battlefield 1. Which sort of came back in a similar kind of way in Battlefield 5 as well, in the form of the shape charge. These might look pretty different to each other, but they both have exactly the same function, being timed explosives that detonate about 3 seconds after they've been planted, sort of acting like a drop and forget C4 type of gadget for sabotaging buildings and vehicles with. Once again, just like a fair few of the other gadgets in this list, these explosive charges can be quite situational, but in the right situation, they can be nasty little buggers, blowing up your enemies and destroying any cover they might be trying to hide behind. Although these charges are highly effective against tanks and vehicles, you can get really creative with them against infantry too. If there's an enemy camping at the top of some stairs, run into the building, throw one of these bad boys at the ceiling, and watch them go boom, while the floor they're standing on disappears. If there's a guy chasing you, run around a corner, spin around, chuck one of these on the floor, and a lot of the time, that guy eager to get another kill will most likely run into its explosion, and feel like a bit of a douche afterwards. There's loads of uses for the shapes and limpet charges in Battlefield, but they don't always seem like particularly common gadgets, at least when you compare them to a lot of the other explosives. They might seem less reliable at times, and you do have to think smart if you want to exploit their power, but they can still be very destructive in the right scenario. Halfway down the list now at number 5, we're staying with Battlefields 1 and 5 with the spotting scope and the trench periscope, both designed to relay your enemy's whereabouts to the rest of your team. This is a really good one for team players, especially on game modes like Rush, Operations and Breakthrough, where there's loads of people making their way forwards towards a certain point, using flanking routes and trying to attack while the opposition defends. You can rack up quite a lot of spotting assists, all contributing to your score. And with this being a recon gadget, it can also be handy for finding enemy snipers far away, making it easier to go and take them on with your rifle. I suppose because DICE got rid of 3D spotting in Battlefield 5, the spotting scope could be seen as a more effective tool on that game than Battlefield 1's trench periscope, with it now being one of the only ways you can actually spot enemies effectively. But either way, they can both be extremely useful for yourself and team, lighting your enemies up like glow sticks at a rave. It's one of the most tactical pieces of equipment you'll be able to find in the Battlefield games, supporting both advancing and defending teams on a variety of modes. It's just a shame this thing doesn't get used more often, because it can be surprisingly effective, often even more so than the spotting flares, which can be shot down or avoided. Next gadget in the list is the motion sensor from the Bad Company games and Battlefield 4, which temporarily pick up enemy movement, making them pop up on the minimap. A lot of people underestimate the power of these little guys, as they can often seem clouded out by a lot of the other recon gadgets, with players often preferring to equip other stuff like claymores, radio beacons, and the TUGS, which I guess are generally more suited for snipers, being able to set up defences and stuff. Kinda makes sense for a lot of people to pick those instead. The motion sensors are only active for a limited amount of time, whereas the TUGS on the other hand does the same job but keeps on working till it's destroyed, making it a better gadget if you plan on sticking around in the same place for a bit. Motion sensors are a lot better for aggressive playstyles, lobbing them into an area and then wiping out the enemies in said area. Not the kind of thing a sniper is normally known for doing. But with that said, the motion sensors can be super effective if you choose to use one of those all-kit carbines or shotguns, using the recon class in a much different way to the norm. Being able to chuck these sensors around whenever you fancy, checking up to see if there's danger around or whether an enemy is trying to sneak up on you, is an extremely useful thing to be able to do. Tactical knowledge will always give you the upper hand, and having access to that tactical knowledge pretty much on demand will make life a hell of a lot easier, while you're raiding buildings, capturing objectives, and making your way across Battlefield's sprawling maps. Coming in at third place is the smoke variant of the rifle grenade, a gadget that's appeared in those games set around the World Wars. This can be a medic player's best friend, being a fair bit more popular in Battlefield 5 with that gadget slot being quite limited, but in Battlefield 1 it was still a very practical tool for concealing your position while you revive, and to block off sight lines and make it easier to move forwards through open areas. A lot of people will argue that using the rifle grenade in Battlefield 1 is a bit of a no-no, because it means that you'll have to sacrifice either your revive needle or the med crate in the process. But sometimes it can be a sacrifice worth making, especially if a lot of other medics are throwing health crates all over the place to heal themselves, meaning it's not always an essential gadget to have, because a health crate isn't usually always too far away anyway. Smoke prevents spotting, and it helps out massively in objective-based game modes like Operations, where teams need to push through areas and take over sectors. If you're blocking all lines of sight and stopping snipers and LMG hill humpers from picking off your teammates while you stroll on up to the next objective, then you'll be able to force your enemies back a lot quicker and easier, making it one of the most effective tactical gadgets in the series. Never underestimate the power of smoke in Battlefield games, even if a lot of other players do. In second place, we've got the good old decoy gadget from Battlefield 4 and Hardline, a pretty good thing to trick people with and create diversions when retreating. Now this is one of those gadgets that might seem a bit rubbish for the average player, but if you play smart and use it carefully, you'll give false information to your enemies, which will make them chase blips on the minimap that aren't even there, letting you lead them into ambushes and take them down from unexpected angles. Or if you really want to be devious, lead them into the path of a claymore, and let that do the dirty work for you. Throw the decoy down in the wrong place, and it'll give you position away, so you don't really want to be chucking them down willy-nilly and expecting them to help out all the time. But combined with a good knowledge of the maps, and a nice plan to trick people passing through an area, the decoy can be a pretty fun way to play cat and mouse and lure enemies into traps. It obviously goes hand in hand with suppressed weapons, as while your enemies are hunting down the decoy, you can be picking them off undetected. But it can also be great for just simply drawing attention away from yourself too, when you need to get the hell away from a dangerous area and retreat to a safer place. Considering this gadget is available to pretty much all classes in Battlefield 4, yet never really gets equipped on many people's loadouts, makes the decoy one of the most underrated gadgets in the franchise. So the last gadget in the video is the MAV from Battlefields 3 and 4, a remote air drone that can float around spotting everyone and detonate explosives and landmines laid down by enemy players. To a lot of people, this thing might seem like a little dopey robot hovering around, not really doing very much. But in a matter of fact, you couldn't be further from the truth, as it can quite literally turn the tides of a match, secretly creating havoc for the other team in hidden ways, without them even really knowing about it. The MAV isn't really a very deadly gadget, unless you detonate someone's explosives while they're stood next to it, but it's definitely one of the most powerful tactical tools in the series, being able to litter the screen with Doritos super quickly and easily, sort of acting like your own personal UAV, while at the same time being quite a tricky thing to counter and shoot down, often becoming a distraction for enemies to fire at, letting your allies take them down while they do. You might not be killing many players while you're buzzing around in the air, but you'll still be assisting your team in many different ways, disabling enemy explosives and making sure an area is safe to pass through before you do so. Considering it's a gadget that not many people tend to use very often, No enemy is safe from the MAV's power. Snipers, campers, squads set up on high vantage points, nobody. Let's put it this way, if you see an enemy MAV hovering around, there's a very good chance that you're currently spotted, and there's a very good chance that someone will be coming to hunt you down. So those are my top 10 most underrated Battlefield gadgets. But make sure you get involved and voice your own choices down below in the comments. And if you happen to use these gadgets and have any cool tricks with them, feel free to share those too. But that's it for another one, folks. Hope you enjoyed the video. Subscribe for more of them coming up in the future, and I'll be seeing you in that next episode.